will now call the March 1st, 2010 Blue Springs City Council meeting to order. If you would stand, we will observe a moment of silence, and then I will lead you in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You may be seated. We'd like to welcome all of you in attendance tonight, as well as those that might be watching on cable TV 7. The next thing I want to do is remind you, if anyone seated out there is parked across the street, the parking lot to the north, I would suggest that you move your vehicle to the east parking lot or on the street. That is a restricted parking area, and we would hate for you to go out and your vehicle is towed. We also have some officers trying to keep watch, but they can't watch everything, so from this point on, please observe not parking in the parking lot to the north of this building. Next, we have the consent agenda. Are there items that need to be pulled? Seeing none, I would accept a motion for the approval.
So moved.
There's a second?
Second.
Roll call, please.
Councilman Lauer? Aye. Councilman Reed?
Aye.
Councilman Fowler?
Aye.
Councilman Shaver?
Aye.
Councilman Edmondson?
Aye.
Councilman Solon? Aye. Carried unanimously.
Next, we have a discussion on the public land and open space zoning district. Councilman Shaver.
Yes, Your Honor. This came to my attention a couple of months ago in regard to the Blue Springs Country Club. That I was surprised to find out we don't really have appropriate zoning at this point for open space, which includes our own parks. It seems odd to me that we have parkland in the city zoned residential. We have zoning to protect residential, we have zoning to protect commercial, but we have no zoning to protect recreational areas. In fact, it's my understanding that the city golf course is zoned agriculture, which in fact is not a Blue Springs zoning, so we are, I believe, it's in violation of our own ordinances. So that's the reason for the proposal of an open space zoning.
Okay, any discussion on that? Is that something the council feel that we need to have staff prepare legislation on? Or Scott, you want to first give us some background? Is there anything that you'd like to add to discussion from Councilman Shaver?
I appreciate Councilman Shaver's comments, Your Honor, and I believe he set up the discussion perfectly. We just had a brief memo from city staff, and there are a few bullet points, just some questions that we were hoping we could get some direction on this evening. So okay. Certainly open up for any comments or questions. Staff did, after speaking with Councilman Shaver, staff did review a number of ordinances, 19 of those in the Kansas City Metro, 9 outstate. And again, the intent of those ordinances that had public land and open space zoning was exactly that, to protect that parkland and open space. There are, as you can see here, this is the north half of Blue Springs, showing the parkland, golf courses, and city golf course, and the Burr Oak Woods Conservation Area. Again, there's about 819 acres of actual city parkland, so there's quite a large area that would be included in any kind of new zoning category that could be developed as a result of any discussion direction here yet tonight. Some of the questions that we wanted to discuss include, again, is the looking at the purpose of such a zoning district. As Councilman Shaver noted, again, protecting public parks, land that would include possibly also government buildings, golf courses, and also public open spaces associated with schools, that is, ball fields, things of that sort. So just trying to get a handle on what the scope would include. A number of the ordinances we looked at include, conservation areas, so state parkland, Again, golf courses, waterways, lakes, ponds, so on and so forth. There's certainly different areas that could be included. Secondly, there's some options for actually instituting the public land and open space zoning district. Again, looking at actually establishing the zoning district would be the first step. Secondly, branch off into two options in terms of creating that new zoning district, rezoning essentially the entire city just to incorporate that new zoning district. Again, we'd have to talk with our city attorney or Williams Campo and see what options we could undertake as regards to state law with that. The easiest in terms of process, in terms of a process we've used regularly with rezoning, obviously, would be to identify specific parcels and rezone each of those one at a time. So could rezone all 18 parks in the city at once, but we'd have to rely on the legal descriptions provided by the county, and those may or may not be the most accurate legal descriptions. Again, some of those legal descriptions are quite old, and again, some of them may not be entirely accurate. So we'd have to look at some options there, and again, would appreciate any feedback in terms of carrying this forward. Timeline obviously is another question, just in terms of how quickly this would need to move forward. Is there a priority for implementing this? As Councilman Shaver noted, for example, the Adams Point Golf Course is old county ag, county zoning. It's not really a category in the city. It's what recently annexed properties usually come into the city as, vacant properties in particular. But once they do add a new use to them, they're usually rezoned. So would that be a priority, or would some of the other parks in particular be additional priorities? And again, we did include some draft ordinance language based on about 50 pages here. That's actually not all of it. That's about a third, maybe a half of what we reviewed. So those are some of the most relevant ordinances in Attachment A. And Attachment B is the draft language that we've put together as staff, just real briefly. And the most important part of that is the use table. I won't go into every single use, but again, this is our zoning use table. That includes all uses in all zoning districts. You can see the first column there lists the use type. The second column lists that public land and open space, the PLOS, just for lack of a better term at this point. And lists P as permitted, C as conditional. So just looking for some feedback in terms of if that's proper designation for those uses, or other uses should be considered either permitted or conditionally as well. So with that, again, I was reminded, and it was not included in the memo, last thing I'll just mention here briefly is that after the Comprehensive Plan Task Force that did yeoman's work in a quick fashion late last year, I did not mention in the memo that the comprehensive plan as it stands also points to looking at a zoning category for public land and open space. It's maybe a little hard to read, but this is a table that was just recently updated, actually, with the Comprehensive Plan Review Task Force. And I highlighted there, in terms of the future land use category, parks and open space, zoning districts that would apply, NA. So I thought it was just interesting to kind of note as a side note here as I conclude the remarks from staff that, obviously that could be changed to something like the parkland open space, PLOS, for example, zoning district. So as it stands now, there is no zoning district, as you can see here in the comp plan, even acknowledges that as well. So with that, I'll stand for any questions and certainly look forward to any kind of input, direction, discussion you may have.
Before we go to questions, I failed to make an introduction. Sitting up here with us tonight is Paul Campo from Williams Campo Law Firms, filling in as our city attorney tonight. So welcome. Now we will go to any questions. Any questions of staff?
I didn't have any questions. I had a few comments.
No questions? Then we'll go to comments.
Can I get a question real
Yes,
quick?
get your question in. Comments.
and I kind of went through this, but how do we address this? I mean, I assume that we could go through, if we decide to go through with this, and do an ordinance, and then per suggestion, staff could compare, and we'd adopt in all parkland, all as one motion to make it a lot simpler. How do we handle that as far as private held lands? For example, Councilman Shaver mentioned the golf course. Not the city golf course, but a private golf course here in the city. That would be up to them to come in, or would we include them in that one big umbrella type thing, or is that what staff's talking about?
That's a very good question. I think that's the direction we'd like to see. With the most recent example that I could point to is the downtown zoning district. That was city initiated, and the city rezoned all of those properties, again, public and private. That's certainly the city's prerogative to do that. But again, it's at the council's direction and discretion in terms of how you would like to proceed with rezoning these individually or as a whole, public versus private, portion of a school ball field, for example. And that was kind of the question about prioritization of implementing this. Do you want to just list off all of the parks and just rezone those and leave the rest just open and have the opportunity for those private individuals, private owners, to take advantage of that zoning and rezone it as such? So there's kind of two different directions here, either kind of rezoning all of it, all inclusive of public and private as identified, golf courses, open spaces, or just the public and then again leave the option open, obviously with the new zoning category, for private to come in and rezone on their own.
How much time do you think staff would have to devote to trying to assemble all this up? I know you already spent a lot of time trying to do the research, but...
Sure. We were just looking at some of the legal descriptions today. I'll kind of point over here to Jim Hawley about perhaps maybe an estimate of, again, we have 18 parks in terms of that. We were looking at, for example, Ems Point Golf Course and Gray Grounds Park are several different parcels kind of assembled together. That'll be the most time consuming to verify those legal descriptions. So it's really dependent upon how deeply we get into the research of those existing legal descriptions before I be comfortable giving you a really firm timeline of that. So again, if we're looking at just the public side of things, it's going to be a lot quicker, obviously, than trying to assemble and pick and choose the other private properties that may be of interest.
Okay.
Did you want to comment on that part of it?
I would comment, I guess, my opinion, and I would ask our attorney here, I would assume we are free to rezone our own land as we so choose, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Private-owned land, I think they would need to come to us and request rezoning would make sense to me. I would think we'd be open to all kinds of criticism if we tried to rezone private-owned land.
Certainly, that would be my opinion as well.
That's just what I was going to say.
Okay. Any other questions of staff before we have comments? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Allen.
Thank you.
Councilman Solon.
Yeah, I guess I don't have a problem with us zoning land we own and parks that we own. My concern lies when we start discussing rezoning privately held land. We would be restricting development of property that the city doesn't own. Staff also in this was proposing that we include schools and golf courses, the one that we own and privately owned. Churches are zoned single family. Are we going to start trying to zone churches or the fire district? I mean, we're kind of opening a can of worms here. It looks like we're trying to control development of privately owned land that was purchased with the zoning in place. I have concerns that this could be considered a taking because we're coming in and trying to rezone property. I'm also very concerned about blanketly rezoning privately owned land.
Councilman, to kind of short circuit this, I think that's pretty much the consensus of everybody up here. If we do anything, we're looking at the land and parks that we own.
Okay, I just want to make sure we have an understanding. If we're talking about privately owned golf courses or schools, that concerns me.
I think that would concern most of us up here.
And, Your Honor, if I may?
Yes.
I guess my question, and I should go back to my logic on what it was and asking how much staff time, it seems like if it gets into a really extensive amount of staff time, are we really gaining anything by doing this? I guess maybe that's an argument we need to have presented. Why do we put all this time and effort into this if it doesn't really gain us anything from the standpoint of the city of us doing that? It's taking our private lands that we own, or the public lands, I guess you'd say, we own, and spend the time to do all this. Are we doing something that's going to gain the city something, or are we doing this for the benefit of somebody else somewhere else?
Anyone care to take a stab at that? Well, I guess my opinion would be, unless you want to do it, is that
Go ahead.
If we do it to our land, it would certainly put in place a means of private people coming to the city asking for that type of zone. Yeah, that's the only benefit that I can see at this point.
I would concur, Your Honor, and certainly in terms of staff time, again, we were just looking today, it really is dependent upon the quality of the legal descriptions that we're getting from the county. And again, it depends, a lot of number of factors in that regard, but if we can go with exactly what is presented from the county parcel database, we could just assemble that as quick as we could talk about it here and present it as rezonings in that regard. But again, a lot of it, we've had issues in the past where if it's an older legal description for rezoning, it may not close in survey speak. Then we'd have gaps and we'd have to do some cleanup later on. But I think just talking with staff earlier today, you may not know that until you go into that whole process. So again, I think it would be fairly quick to assemble the existing legal descriptions and move forward with rezoning of the city-owned land, as we're talking about here.
Your Honor,
Yes.
I guess I would question why go through all of that. We own the land today. If there's errors in the legal description, they're there right now. What really changes if we rezone it? Why do we need to go through the legal description? The risk, to me, the risks are not changing. We're simply, just because we change the zoning. Is it worth having a park survey, for example? It seems to me we're not changing, our ownership is not changing, therefore I would think we'd leave it the same.
Well,
Mr. Johnson.
go ahead.
Councilman Shaver, if we get to the point where the council actually adopts a zoning category for this, before we would put together a pretty detailed implementation plan, and we would do an analysis of the amount of time and resources that would go into that, and we would certainly spend a lot of time with our city attorney reviewing whether or not it would be appropriate to move forward with existing legal descriptions, or whether or not there would be some need to update and refresh those legal descriptions.
Did that answer your question, Councilman?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Councilman Reed, and then Councilman Lau.
I just want to bring up the same thing that Kent did.
Councilman Edmondson?
Yeah, that guy right over there. Anyway, to follow up on that, I kind of agree that, everything's been status quo and haven't had a problem with any of our public properties that I know of when it comes to this. I think what's really is in contention, what's brought it up, is some privately held that would like to go and be able to obtain that type of zoning. So I have no idea if this is possible or not, but could we just put in place a zoning that if somebody requests it, it is available, and not necessarily rezone everything that the city has? We could have a zoning category that would be available if a person wanted to come in and seek it for their use, or if in the city decided it would be a good idea that they could use it, but that we wouldn't necessarily have to jump right in full force and do it right now.
It's a good question. Who would like to answer that?
I'll answer that, Your Honor. We certainly, I think, are willing to accept that as a strategy. If the council chooses, I think we've got some fairly good language drafted already that we can refine. We can bring that forward. I think an initial outline was we could have that to you perhaps by the April 5th council meeting, and you could adopt a code, and then it could be a part of our UDC and could be available for anyone who would choose to seek that rezoning, and we could leave things as they are.
Seems to make more sense and less work for everything.
Is there kind of a concurrence to that?
Yes, sir. I had the same thought as Councilman Reed. in that the scope of this can be very, very broad, which certainly takes into account staff time and research and so forth, as we were just discussing, and I believe Councilman Schaefer, the reason this was brought up was due to private open space. And so if we contain that scope to deal with private open space, but at the same time, let us make sure that should we decide to do something with the city, that it would be, basically connected, or there would be a connectivity to that with private property as far as the zoning and so forth. So I would agree with Councilman, what's your name? Sissy. Councilman Reed, in order to focus on the private property first.
Okay, Councilman Evanson.
Your Honor, and just to further on that, we just recently did some changing here for wind turbines. I mean, that was brought in by a public or private person that wanted to be able to do that, and so we put together the ordinances and zones. I mean, this would be real typical to me, similar to what we've done there. So there's grounds for it, so why not?
So I guess I have instructions to staff is, why don't you go ahead and proceed with language that you can bring back, start the process, because I would imagine that has to go through the Planning Commission. Yes. Okay. So why don't we go ahead and start that process to adopt an ordinance that hopefully about the April 5th meeting.
We will do that, Your Honor. We'll proceed as instructed. We'll have to notice that up. I believe this week we'll actually provide a public notification that will go out, and we will take this to the Planning Commission as soon as possible. It is included and is a part of our UDC, and then it will be brought back here. We'll take input from the Planning Commission and then bring it back to the City Council.
Okay.
Thank you.
Your Honor, the date for that Planning Commission meeting would be March 22nd.
Pardon?
March 22nd for the Planning Commission.
For the Planning Commission,
For the April
that's
5th.
by April 5th.
Yes, correct.
Okay, very good.
And to add to, or to question that, would that be a public hearing at that point? Okay.
Okay, next we have a discussion on the Missouri Innovation Park. I received a request to have an update. I in turn asked the president of the Blue Springs Economic Development Corporation, Brian Starner, to prepare a presentation. But before I do that, I want to personally thank the provosts. I want to first welcome and thank the provosts for the flagship university in Columbia, MU, or Mizzou, for coming tonight, along with Mary Ann McCullum, who is no stranger to this area. And I think your attendance here tonight shows your commitment with the partnership and the relationship we've established over the last year or two in establishing what we believe is going to be crucial for jobs for the future, in not only for the Blue Springs area, but for this region and the state of Missouri. So we want to thank you for coming, and I know we're going to be hearing from you after Brian's presentation. So Brian.
And then, okay, great. Thanks, Dan. Your Honor, members of council, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here this evening and give you an update. And as the mayor has shared, we have with us guests from the University of Missouri with whom we're partnering on this project. And I know for many of us in this room tonight, and particularly those of you on council, you've seen the front part of this program that I'm going to go over. But the attempt tonight was really a reflection back on the MOU that was agreed to and adopted unanimously by council. And I don't know if the date was December of '08, but somewhere in that general time frame, where we have a memorandum of understanding between the Economic Development Corporation, the University of Missouri, and the City of Blue Springs. So as we go through the presentation, it's really to give you an update as to what we've been doing, where we're at in that process, and really more of the details will come in the latter end. And if I could ask you to write your questions down, hold them, and give the opportunity for the provost to give his presentation, we'll both stand for questions. As a reminder, the Blue Springs Growth Initiative Corporation that we created, 501c3, was set up really to act as a vehicle to facilitate this process that we're involved in with the University of Missouri and the Innovation Park. And through this entity, we're channeling most of the efforts and activity, including the funding that the EDC has directed over there out of our budget, funding from Kansas City Power and Light, funding from the City Council. That has gone into the 501c3, which has put together the properties and really the contracts related to advancing the development of the Missouri Innovation Park. We have a number of partners in this process, and frankly, it's one of the things that in very challenging and troubling times, when I look at what's going on in the country and frankly within our own region, and I think you received maybe a copy, Ann, if I'm not mistaken, an article that just came out of last week's Business Journal. When you take a look at real estate, which I think we full well know, there are great challenges out there in terms of advancing projects. Those that are well established, whether they're in retail or office or other forms of development. And just as a reminder for all of us, this project really began not so much as an idea from any single entity, but as a dialogue and a collaboration of concept amongst a number of partners. And I want to identify those on the slide, chiefly the City of Blue Springs and the University of Missouri, but also part and parcel of this process, Kansas City Power and Light. We've been working very closely with Jackson County, the Animal Health Corridor that runs from Manhattan, Kansas to Columbia, Missouri, the organization that really brands and markets this region, the Kansas City Area Development Council, the Kansas City Area Life Science Institute, and some recent assistance has come in the form of support from the Blue Springs School District and Central Jackson County Fire Protection District, who really recognize the value and importance of what this project could mean to the region and to Blue Springs. A short reflection on what it is we're trying to do. Really, the intent is to do something that goes beyond traditional economic development, which in the times that we're in and what we've been sliding into over the last 2 to 3 years, and probably what we're going to be in for the next several years, is moving away from trying to identify a project that's way out beyond the horizon and hope that we're in the right place at the right time with the right resources to land that company when there's a great deal of global competition to try to land a company with capital investment and jobs. The strategy instead is to go after a focus that plays to regional advantages and to target knowledge-based workforce. What does that mean? That's jobs that have a higher education component involved, not necessarily a 4-year degree from college, but community college, works that come out of vocational workforce development, but also advanced degrees. All of those play a role in advancing a 21st century jobs component. Our intent is to bring both the public and the private sector together. Key to this whole concept, in fact, without this component with the University of Missouri, we would not have the strategy we have today, is integrating the University of Missouri in this mix. We've also had interest as of late from Metropolitan Community College, and of course we have Blue River Community College campus not far from here. They're looking at what this means in terms of how they program students and advance them through the chain of higher education, including and up to the University of Missouri. We want to link scientific research, higher education, and entrepreneurial development in our strategy, and frankly bring commercialization along Adams Dairy Parkway. But it's very important, I think, that we recognize the benefits of this will go well beyond Adams Dairy Parkway. In fact, I'm getting calls from throughout the metro, communities and companies that are looking at what we're doing and trying to identify a strategy that maybe fits their corporate need or their community, where they move beyond just trying to target an individual company. Bear with me. In essence, this is a strategic, high-value, long-term economic development strategy, and it benefits not only Greater Kansas City and Blue Springs, but Western Missouri. What you see on the screen in front of you is where we're at today in terms of what I would call a master land use concept. And through this process, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail how we arrived at this. Nothing is formal. In fact, that yet lies in front of us, but this identifies a location after looking at and having months and months worth of meetings with the University of Missouri and what is comprised of the Missouri Innovation Park Planning Committee, representatives from Kansas City Area Development Council, Kansas City Power and Light, Economic Development Corporation, Blue Springs Growth Initiatives, University of Missouri, City of Blue Springs. And I think most of you in the room are familiar with approximately the layout. Artie Mize is the northern boundary, Adams Dairy Parkway is the western boundary, running down to just about 40 Highway and running east to about Brizendine Road. And the areas that we've noted are areas of principal focus. The areas that have buildings on it, again, concept at this point, represents approximately 63 acres of the 117 acres that's currently under contract. And as you move south, we have areas that are more part of a conceptual linkage that tie into property we have under contract with American Legion that will really play to the current zoning and comprehensive plan of a light industrial focus. Probably more in the fabrication, could be pharma, medical devices, etc. Some key facts. Some of these things are going to be quite recognizable to you. Blue Springs Growth Initiative and Blue Springs Economic Development Corporation are the entities that are really the chief respondents in facilitating this process. Although several months ago we brought on board MC Realty Group acting as a construction manager, advisor, or project manager, depending on what our needs are. We've received first and second rounds of capitalization, chiefly from the City of Blue Springs up to this point, $850,000. Kansas City Power and Light, through their acquisition of Aquila, has $200,000. And then the Blue Springs Economic Development Corporation has placed up to $150,000, and that may well increase again. What we've utilized these funds for, a variety of purposes: real estate, engineering and planning, project analytics, to really get to an understanding of what is it that will result from the strategy and its execution, job creation, types of companies, payroll, economic impact, etc. We also have marketing components, legal, and legislation, which I'll get into in a few minutes. 117 acres is the area under contract now. The Mizzou Center component that has been under discussion would represent approximately 10 acres in terms of a land use consideration. And from the university standpoint, what we're looking at is things like technology licensing, commercialization, and frankly trying to develop a royalty stream not only for the University of Missouri but for the system and to the benefit of Missouri-based companies and entrepreneurs. And then we frankly want to get in a position where we can help the companies that are here in Blue Springs and in this region be able to position themselves long-term for a collaboration between the University of Missouri and other tenants that we would locate to the park to give them a distinct global advantage. And I think, frankly, in talking to several members of council, that's why over the last 4 to 5 months I've had unsolicited inquiries from companies, not necessarily looking at locating, but really interested in what type of role and component and the timing of MU's play for coming into Blue Springs. And to be specific, I think the intent, as I visited with these companies, is looking at a differentiating factor that gives them some distinct competitive advantage 12, 18, 24 months down the road, because they know they're not necessarily going to be able to compete with the labor costs in Southeast Asia. But from a value add standpoint, they think there's some longevity that they might be able to develop in a yet undefined way. Here's an economic snapshot, and although these numbers might be very apparent, and I'm not going to go over all of them, I want to give you some context of how we arrived at these projections. I took an analysis from 4 years' worth of activity from the Missouri Department of Economic Development and Kansas City Area Development Council in terms of projects that moved through their pipelines where Blue Springs either was or could have been a component of consideration. Typically, these projects want to go to properties that are under control, they're zoned, they have infrastructure to them, they're ready to turn dirt. Not unlike what we saw with stimulus-related funds, they needed to be shovel-ready. So when we stripped out those duplicates, what we ended up with was a universe of opportunity that as I spoke with both organizations, we identified a probability of between a company to a company and a half a year that we felt over about 25 years we could reasonably expect to land in this park with the strategy that I've identified. The result, as we projected it with various types of companies, medical device, IT, and other forms of life science-related companies, was about 41 corporate locations. And one of the things that's really important, because it's often not attributed in my field, we're not looking at a home run here of landing the life science equivalent of an automotive assembly plant. And that's probably not a good analogy these days, but 5 years ago, it was. Communities across this country went after them with a great deal of fervor. We really went after more scaled companies, 10, 15, 25,000 square feet, one or two that might be a little bit larger than that, and looked at the type of wages that I was already seeing and that were part of this portfolio. The result was, over 25 years, 15 if it was accelerated, we could expect a pretty big payout for this community with our ability to put this strategy with MU as an anchor on the ground in Blue Springs. Approximately $340 million of capital investment, 3,700 direct jobs, and then certainly an indirect job component. How do we get there? Last year as well as this year, many of us, the mayor, Eric Johnson, myself, members of both the boards of the EDC and Blue Springs Growth Initiative, and some of those that are allies of ours have been advocating on behalf of legislation. It was a different bill last year. This year it's Senate Bill 922, which is sponsored by Senator Victor Callahan. We also have House Bill 1635. Eric's reminding me of that. And Representative Tim Fluke, who chairs Economic Development, has advocated for that bill in the House. We have a fighter with Senator Victor Callahan in the Senate, and we're already attached to other bills, including omnibus legislation. Even as of tonight, I'm negotiating with the Department of Economic Development, trying to get their comfort level high enough where they would be supportive of the legislation. Last year, with a different administration, or a new administration, frankly, I think there was a little more hesitancy this year. I'm very hopeful that we can reach that agreement of our legislation, what it can do for this park, and try to get that support and acknowledgement, including from the gentleman who represents the department, David Kerr, who just came out of Kansas. David's familiar with this type of legislation and its benefits. Well, what it would do is capture employment taxes. We had at one point a component to capture retail sales taxes that would be net new incremental revenue to the state. The Department of Economic Development feels very strongly that they don't want to see that. And it would assist us in land purchase and infrastructure. This is a quick snapshot of some of the names I've just identified. Certainly, many of our legislative delegation locally have been very supportive. Today, significantly different than last year, we now have a coalition, and that coalition is Missouri Jobs for the Future. There's a website that we're going to be sharing here any day now. We have cities from throughout Missouri that have identified this strategy as one that their communities, give you one example, Liberty, has really engaged in, and they want to advance a similar type of concept that fits their marketplace and their unique assets and benefits, and they expect this legislation as an important tool in that process. It also helps that Representative Fluke represents Liberty, and that the mayor there served in the House of Representatives with Mayor Carson Ross, and I think they understand that this can't be done by communities alone. There needs to be a partnership with the state. There's also some federal legislation that's moving through the pipeline, and I'm not going to go into detail. That hasn't come out of the House or the Senate yet, but we're keeping our eye on it related to trying to get stimulus or other related program funding. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on this timeline, but this gives you, this is a very high level. I think this normally runs about 4 pages. This is a quick snapshot of some major milestones. And I think key dates that are worth noting here is starting with the initial investment that we received from the city and committed by Blue Springs Economic Development Corporation and Aquila. We had approximately $600,000 back in April of 2008. And as we have rolled through this process, we've raised additional capital, leading to our ability to execute an MOU with the university in December of 2008. And during our work through the RFQ process, when we engaged Trammell Crow, we actually came out with several deliverables, and towards the end of that approximately 120-day process, both parties decided to mutually part ways, and we took that information that we had developed in conjunction with Trammell Crow and engaged MC Realty to continue to advance our efforts. We had done a lion's share of the work that you've seen reported on right now, and MC Realty waits in the wings for the opportunity to engage on specific projects. And then frankly, what I've just shared with you, statewide legislation has been filed. We expect sometime soon, which I'm going to leave for Brian Foster to address directly, what MU's continued interest is in the Missouri Innovation Park. And here in the next 30, 60 days, Blue Springs Growth Initiative is looking at making application related to the land use planning and entitlements associated with executing the plan and the strategy that you see on the board that's been presented, and we'll be initiating that sometime very soon. This is a copy of the resolution that was, again, unanimously adopted by council to engage in the MOU with the University of Missouri. And what I've chosen to do, instead of going into the the memorandum of understanding, which is several pages in length, is really give you an opportunity here to let me quickly walk you through what its key components are, what it called for that we would do as partners in this process, and what we have done. We've gone through an RFQ process, and I just identified we've transitioned to MC Realty as a project manager, as advisor. We have also gone to the point of presenting and ready to file with the city a strategic master land use plan that fits the concept that's been a part of the discussions with the people that have been on the Missouri Innovation Park Planning Committee, including the University of Missouri and representatives from the city. In terms of acquisition of property, like it seems any development project these days, we've had to go back to the property owners and identify, in most cases with them, that our desire to take down the property by September 2010 would be challenging. We've got one or two properties that we may well decide to go forth with, but in terms of scope of buying down all 117 acres, we've got some strong understanding from the property owners in that regard, and Bill Reisinger has been a lead communicator in that respect. They recognize that much of this is going to depend on getting enabling legislation at the state level. So our focus, like much of the market, like what's in the articles in front of you out of the Business Journal, is how do you advance projects that have the fundamentals in place, where the strategy is right, the market timing, once this economy begins to correct itself, 18, 24 months, will recognize the value of those projects. And in fact, I think it was 2 weeks ago, in one of the newspapers, the governor was quoted as saying this is the type of project he felt fit the return of the economy. So we're pressing forward. In terms of Mizzou Center, this has been a part of the conversations, what eventually could have a presence from the University of Missouri. And again, I don't want to take time away from the provost, Brian Foster. I will leave that to him to address a little bit more detail. But we have continued to have close engagement. I was just in Columbia last night. We have the provost here tonight, and I can assure you he is a busy person, and he would not be here without his strong sense of commitment to what this means for the university. Private financing. One of the things we're challenged with and that we are working to address is that finding additional private financing to bring this project forward. Again, I think there's some conversations we've had with the University of Missouri that we will work in close partnership with them to identify some of those opportunities, some from the corporate sector and some from MU alumni, and perhaps some from grants and particular programs that might come out of stimulus-related initiatives. And then finally, looking at the public financing component that would be helped by legislation at the House or Senate level. As we look at how we advance this project, I know I've had a conversation with Roscoe. related to the concept that you saw on the screen related to retaining the golf course. Our intent is to work through and around the golf course. Nothing's set in stone. There's no definitive plans for infrastructure. Frankly, it was trying to create a unified concept of how we could link properties that were not immediately contiguous and not disrupt the golf course. And I want to give this council full reassurance that it's a high-value asset that we have out there, and the intent is to work with that asset to maximize its attractiveness for tenants that would bring to the Innovation Park. So our intent is to disrupt as little as possible the Adams Point Golf Course. And then frankly, more specifically, we have engaged under contract Robin Sluter. Robin came from St. Mary's Medical Center as the president CEO, and we've asked her to put together under contract a capital campaign that would put us in a position of being able to go out and solicit, as I mentioned, corporate, alumni, and other gifters that are very interested in what this park might represent to them within the within the greater Kansas City area. This is a pie chart that gives a rough description of where we're at in terms of how we've spent the funds that we've received. Approximately $1.1 million has been spent to date. Some of that's on land assembly, earnest money deposits to secure the property, all going towards the purchase price. We also have a small portion towards project promotion and events, being at events that, as we will be at in a week, the University of Missouri has a Life Science Summit at UMKC. We will have a presence there. And we also have contract services related to legal legislation, project development, and planning. All expected and necessary as part of advancing the project. And with that, I'm going to thank you for my portion of the program and turn it over to the Provost, Brian Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Sterner, and again, welcome, Dr. Foster.
Thank you, Brian. Mayor Ross, members of the council, I'm really pleased to be here tonight, have a chance to reconnect and confirm our commitment to this project. Let me start by just saying that flat out, we are committed to this project. This we see as a big win-win opportunity for the university and for the Blue Springs area, and I'll try to give you a little bit of a sense, a reminder of why I see it as such a win-win situation. For one thing, we're coming, I'll put it this way, we're going to come earlier to Blue Springs with a physical presence than we had planned before. Before, we had planned to come after facilities had been built within the park. Now we've decided that we would like to come and have a physical presence here and get started, get a running start on our MU presence, on the functions that we want to perform to help attract clients or tenants to the park and that sort of thing, to get that done now. And we plan to have, we actually hoped we might even get a lease signed today. It didn't quite happen, but we're working hard on getting space leased so that we can be here in Blue Springs and doing the things that we think will contribute to the success of the park. We should be doing that within this month. That's our hope anyway. But this is a couple years before we had planned to be here when we talked earlier, and I think this is actually a very productive change in the plan. We hope what we will bring to the park is the Mizzou advantage, the areas of strength that we have that match so well with the corporate clusters here in Kansas City. These are going to be very important assets for recruiting firms to Blue Springs and the greater Kansas City area, I would have to say. These are areas where Mizzou is world-class, and what we can bring then is all kinds of connections with tenants in the park that they would not be able to get elsewhere. That's the important point. The connections with us, things that we can do for them, they could not get elsewhere, because these are areas where we really have world-class strength. And the ones Brian mentioned what they were, the three in particular. One of them has to do with animal health and the convergence of animal health with human health, number one. And number two, with food for the future. And number three, with energy, sustainable energy. So we'll begin working with Brian and others on the recruitment process, recruiting firms who are potential tenants in the park. We'll begin doing that, well, we're doing it now, but we'll be doing it in earnest with a physical presence here that'll add an awful lot more credibility to our presence and to the presence of the park, really, in attracting people to come here and enjoy the kinds of benefits that we can help bring. Some of the kinds of, we'll be building infrastructure, another way to put this, we'll be building the infrastructure we're going to need to bring our advantages to the park. We'll be building that infrastructure starting now. And that'll include some of the following things. There are really two big, if you step back and look at it, the big picture, there are really two big things we can bring to the park. One of them is world-class workforce. That's just important to any firm that might want to locate there. And the other is potential research and development collaborations with the university. Again, areas where we're world-class. We prepare world-class workforce in these areas, and we have world-class researchers that can collaborate. And that'll take several forms. There'll be distance education facilities that will get established here within the next month or two. That'll take some distance ed programs that we deliver here in the greater Kansas City area now, centralize it all in Blue Springs, and allow us to have an infrastructure to do training for workforce later on distance learning basis. We'll have a veterinary medicine presence that'll be a physical presence again. They're a presence now, but they'll have a physical presence and be doing much more interaction with the firms in the Kansas City area animal health group. We'll have small business support from the offices and extension that provide small business. This is consulting report and services like, say, implementing IT systems, things like that we can do for startup businesses to help them get off to a running start. We'll be identifying the kinds of R&D relationships that we can have with prospective tenants. That will include things like placing postdoctoral fellows in the labs of tenants. That's an incredible resource in two ways. One is these are very high-end researchers, on the one hand, that can come and work in the lab of one of the tenants. On the other hand, these are potentially wonderful appointments to the staff of the tenant. It's a way for them to get a foot in the door in recruiting the university's best people. But placing postdocs, placing interns in the companies in various forms, striking up research relations that would really take place within the high-end faculty labs in Columbia, using, say, the reactor and imaging technologies and things like that we would have there that are unique or very unusual. And then, of course, we'll assess and prepare to meet the workforce needs of the tenants. That is to say, we'll have degree programs we do have degree programs that train people within these areas that I mentioned, but they'll be focused, we can focus those better on the needs of employers. We'll be working on degree completion programs for students for employees with two-year degrees. A good example is, that's being prepared is a four-year degree completion program for people that have a two-year vet tech degree, veterinary technology degree, so that they can have a higher level. And my understanding is there's a lot of demand in the general area for that kind of a degree. Another example would be continuing education, that is non-degree kinds of programs for professional development. So anyway, to go back to where I started, we're going to be here now. We're not going to wait 2 years. We'll be building this infrastructure, working with Brian and working with others that are recruiting firms here, bringing, I think, some very important world-class competencies, programs to the Blue Springs area in ways that should be incredibly important assets in recruiting firms. So, be happy to take questions.
Brian, would you also come up and any questions of the council to Dr. Foster or either Mr. Stern? Any questions?
I guess I had one question for the provost. I know you're saying you're building infrastructure, but the infrastructure would be employees and people that you bring from
That's what I mean, is programmatic infrastructure.
How many people are going to be actually working at the facility that you're leasing, or how many people do you plan to hire?
Well, I haven't thought of it that way. Let me count, hold on. I'd say initially, maybe 10 or 12 initially, something on that order.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none.
I would say I had questions for Mr. Starner. I didn't want to jump in before anybody else. Did anyone else on the council have questions?
You're up second, sir.
Okay. And I thank you for coming and doing your presentation, and I would say my questions now are going to be directed at Mr. Starner.
Okay.
So I'll make you stand up here.
Thank you. Go sit down.
Yeah, take it, relax a little bit, thank you.
Yes, Dr. Foster?
Okay, great. That's why I was asking.
Oops.
Thank you so very much
Is your
for coming this
microphone on?
evening. I'm sorry. Thank you very much for coming this evening. I can appreciate the journeys that you have been on. This Innovation Park has been exciting when it was first announced, and now that we hear more about what it's actually bringing to the community as far as education and workforce and help with small businesses and all those sorts of things, those are just really exciting things to have happen. And I appreciate the commitment of MU and the continued effort to come to Blue Springs. Looking very forward to that.
Well, thank all of you very much. I mean, this collaboration is taking a good shape, I think, and it's going to take off. So, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Councilman Sullivan, and Mr. Starner.
I had some questions for Mr. Starner. I want to thank you for coming today and giving us an update. I truly appreciate. I appreciate the provost coming here today and telling us what's going on with MU and all the exciting news. I know everyone in Blue Springs is very excited about the possibility of new businesses and new jobs being brought to our city. So thank you for coming here. I had some questions. Back in May of 2009, when you and Mr. Reisinger came before the City Council to request the additional funds that were discussed earlier, the $600,000, and we were told that that was being advanced to the EDC and that the taxpayers of Blue Springs would be reimbursed those funds. And the timeline was supposed to be already had started. So I was curious, at what point in time will the taxpayers be reimbursed for that money that they actually kind of fronted?
Yeah, great question, and I appreciate that. One of the things that I've shared with our group is in the last 30, 45 days, we've now got a baseline understanding of what the cost will be to develop some of the initial property, and we've put together a spreadsheet of cost recovery related to repaying the city as the property is developed. There's not going to be one single transaction we're going to be able to turn around a check for $600,000 plus interest, but we have scheduled into the real estate purchase price that covers the cost of development related to those properties going forward for the Innovation Park.
And I guess my question would be, when do you anticipate that we'll receive our first reimbursement?
I don't know today that I could pick a definitive date and time, other than it's going to commence on the first sale of property on Adams Dairy Parkway related to the Innovation Park. And maybe to get a little closer to this question, something that I have a better understanding of, we have a resolution from the board of Mid-Continent Public Library, and I think at one point you raised some questions, well, how does that fit in? One way to think about the University of Missouri, and not in any way to diminish the university, is the university is much like the carrot in front of the horse. They're drawing the attention of private sector investment, and that would be a component that Mid-Continent Public Library, in terms of the discussions we had with them, would also bring forward. But in their case, there's an interest in potentially buying real estate that would co-locate in this same environment. That's an entity that we've had conversations with, that as we look at how do we get to cost recovery, how do we get to our goal of development of the Missouri Innovation Park, along with other components related to private sector entities that are interested in Mizzou's presence, it's going to be a scale of 1, 3, 5 acres at a time per transaction, with a cost recovery model that doesn't so much disrupt the cost of the real estate as to still make it competitive for the marketplace. So today I can't tell you exactly when anyone's going to commit, but we don't have plans filed today. So even today, if somebody wanted to buy real estate, we haven't gone through the permitting and planning process which they expect.
I guess the reason I'm asking this is because the trigger previously was a development agreement with the master developer. So
Yes.
when we had Trammell Crow, the target date that the taxpayers would be reimbursed was September of 2010. Now we have MC Realty. Do we have a development agreement with MC Realty, and is that the trigger where the taxpayers get reimbursed?
No, and these are good questions. In the case of Trammell Crow, one of the things that's happened over the last 12 months and perhaps maybe just a little bit longer is, and you see this with every project virtually that comes in front of this council, the capital markets and the gridlock that they've created to advance financing for development has frozen most developers in their place related to buying property at scale like what we proposed. One of the challenges that Trammell Crow faced at the end when we were finishing our work with them is when they started, they had a lot of interested capital partners. Towards the end, the market had changed not only for them, but for everybody. So in recognition that that was not going to recover immediately, that was not going to change with Trammell Crow or any other master developer, the group met, and after significant discussion, we chose that we still had solid concepts, solid strategy, the fundamentals were in place, that we should not go back and try to re-execute an agreement for a master developer because the market would not recognize that. The market would not allow capital to flow to somebody to buy 100 or 200 or 300 acres and sit on it for 25 years.
And I understand that. I guess I want to just make clear that this is a change than what we were told in May. We were told in May that there was going to be a timeline, and the goal was September 2010 to start receiving payments. So I'm just trying to establish the point that there has been a change in policy, and at this point in time, we don't have a timeline when the taxpayers will be reimbursed anymore.
No, and this is part of the updates that we provided, including the council 2-on-2s back in October. To get to your question about MC Realty, we've not executed an agreement with them to be a master developer because we don't have a project. So basically, they've been donating their services pro bono.
My next question, I had quite a few here. It's been a while since we've had an update. I would say it's been since May, so.
It's actually October. We had the council 2-on-2 meetings that Bill Reisinger and I met with many of you.
And I can kind of talk some of the things that we had discussed at that meeting. At the May meeting, the city council was advised when you were asking for the $600,000, we were told that MU was going to build a facility, and that's what the city council was told. So when I hear the provost say that MU was going to come after buildings came and were built, that contradicts what we were told in May, that MU was going to be the first building and planned to build a building. So that contradicts what I was told in May. So my first question would be, at what point in time did you realize that MU was not going to actually build a building at MIP?
Well, I think the leaked memo that got out was the earliest information that I had. Part of this process, like it is in any multi-party contract, and part of the reason you have it going through Blue Springs Growth Initiative is I can't divulge information related to real estate contracts or even development issues that are outside of the parties to that agreement. So in the case of, I think it was maybe in the last 30 days, that was really the earliest that I knew about it. I think and I'm not going to speak for the provost, but one of the things that we've come to recognize, and many of my board members from both the EDC as well as Blue Springs Growth Initiative will address this, the market has changed dramatically in 60 days. And no less for the state of Missouri, that's going to have a huge revenue drop-off, which impacts the University of Missouri. However, and let me address it this way, the earliest, if we had everything ready to go today, in terms of going through the entitlement process, that anyone could be in the Innovation Park is probably January of 2012. And whether, the way I look at it, whether or not we recognize that that's about a year and a half to 2 years out, we're going to have the University of Missouri here on the ground in advance of that. The schedule has changed, and it's no reflection on any individual or any party. I think it frankly is a reflection of what's happened, what we're all grappling with in the last 60 to 90 days. It became evident to me in the last 30 to 45.
I bring that up because when I voted in executive section to give another $600,000, that was really a really key component for me, was MU's commitment that they were going to build a building, and that made a difference to me for approving the additional $600,000.
And I have to address, I don't have that language or contract in front of me, and I don't disagree with what you're stating. I don't know at that point that any of us knew when they would build the building. I think the intent was, as we began our discussions with them and went through the entire course of last summer, meeting with them to frame what it is that this MIP would look like, what components would be in the park. And in that process, I believe from maybe last April until the fall, they came out with the Mizzou Advantage. Out of those components that came out of that process, we began winnowing down exactly what that might look like. And I think we have a sense of what that physical presence might be in addition to a lease. But in today's marketplace, and going back to when we presented to council, I don't know that I had any definitive knowledge of when a building would go up.
But you told us. You told us in the meeting that they were building a building. You reassured us that.
Well, Councilman, things change. And he doesn't have any way of knowing what the market's going to dictate. I mean, if we had known that, a lot of us would be in a lot better shape today had we known the market was going to go the way that it did. And basically, I think the main thing is everybody's doing their due diligence to make this project happen. I mean, there's nobody trying to skirt the issue. Everybody's trying to make it happen. And certainly, he doesn't have a crystal ball to be able to know all these things.
And I appreciate that, and I know we all would like to have a crystal ball. The reason why I am centering on this is because that was a very important component for me to approve. I was very torn and had a very hard decision to make for that $600,000. It's a lot of money for us right now in our budget. We have a lot of things we need to buy, such as radio equipment for our police officers. So it was a tough decision, and I voted for it. Two of the things that concern me is that when the master developer was hired, Trammell Crow,
they were engaged. They weren't contracted to be the master.
Correct. And they said that their only critical failure concern was if MU did not locate at MIP. So that, to me, was a critical component that you had shared with us. And also, a citizen gave to me, after we had voted, the spring 2009 Mizzou alumni newsletter. And in that newsletter, Tom Henderson, who is the assistant to the provost of the MU Office of Economic Development, and the article was all about Missouri Innovation Park. And this was from the spring, at the same time that we were approving the additional funds. And in the article, it said that although MU is a partner in the research park, we're not going to make any capital investment in the facility. We will cover the operational costs of the building we use, and the working group is also charged with developing a plan for the financing of those day-to-day operations. So it appears to me that the alumni of MU were advised that MU was not making capital improvements, but that is something that we were all unaware of.
I might just address that. I think what's been on the table consistently in conversations were not dictating an outcome without going through the analysis. The intent is to have a physical presence. And as we've discussed with you many times, whether MU owns their own physical assets, or they lease space, or they occupy a new building in the community, fundamentally we achieve the same goal. It's the presence of the university's assets. Yes, it would be of high value and great importance for us to have additional assets from MU. In recognition that they're doing this 2 years in advance of anything that we've scoped over the last 8 months, I look at this as a benefit when there's not many things about the marketplace that are offering benefit.
I'm very happy that I would have been much more confident if we had a building built, just as many of us were, but the fact they're leasing space is a good news. So I don't want to take away from that. I'm pleased that they are leasing space. On another topic, I'm looking at the numbers, and it looks like that on land assembly, we have spent $508,000. my question is, we have gone from 225 acres, which we originally had put land options on, down to 117 acres. So that means that we have let 108 acres go that we had put money down in land options. The understanding with land options is you lose that money when you let the property go. So my question is, how much money have we lost? And I know you don't like that term loss, but to me it's losing the money when you don't purchase the land options go away. So I guess I'm looking for a number on how much the taxpayers have lost on land options at this point in time.
I'll address that number. Before I do, I might address for you, there are several ways you can go about this process. We had advice, my information was shared with at least one board and some general information with the EDC, although it was all conducted really under the auspices of Blue Springs Growth Initiative. Short of buying the real estate and, in our case, negotiating with these properties to purchase under a scenario that would have had it, in most cases, September 2010, we were minimizing the amount of money that we had going out. So instead of paying lump sum for the options, and at least in one case and a few others, we staged that money out over a period of time during the 2 years that from when we began this process to when we would conclude the purchase. We've released about 108 acres, as you identify. One of those parcels was released because physically, after we went through the analysis, the geoanalytics related to the site, we recognized it would have been very cost prohibitive to have developed. And it would have made the property challenging for anyone to have linked it into the balance of the park on the south side. That property represented the initial 20 acres that sat right on I-70 immediately east of the Heartland Financial Building. The balance of the property you're identifying is east of Brizendine Road, and we were making monthly payments in lieu of making a staged larger lump sum payment or even quarterly payments to that property owner. And I think the number is approximately $160,000. And I think one of the questions you raise really gets down to even how we reimburse the city. What we're looking at is recovering that money over time as we sell the property. And there's a lot of upfront development costs related to anyone that's ever come in front of you to secure the property, option the property, frankly, do engineering and planning and bring it through the entitlement process. Our view was we didn't have that kind of a checkbook. We were getting a little bit of money, significant money, but a little bit of money to undertake a process that if we could get the momentum going with the University of Missouri, with the marketplace that we've now started to get engagement from, we could begin to take down the property either through our enabling legislation in lump sum, all 117 acres in this case, or what we've backed up to do today is taking it down in smaller tracts. And we have an understanding with most of the property owners that remain that that might be a viable way that would work for them to advance this innovation park.
So we plan at this point to continue to keep 117 acres in land options?
Yes.
That's the plan?
Yes.
Did the EDC ever consider putting the property under first right of refusal, which would cost, when we wouldn't have had to put that money out?
There are a lot of reasons, there are a lot of ways that we looked at doing this. The recommendation and consensus was for the property owners that were involved. I've been here 5 years, and if anything is challenging, it's trying to get property owners in that corridor especially to maybe come together as a group and be willing to commit to something that's anything less than a certain definitive purchase. In our case, I think through the mayor's leadership efforts with American Legion, with Janie Gilkey and some other property owners, we're able to convey a sense of benefit that this would be to those property owners as well as to Blue Springs, and they've really worked as partners with us. They weren't willing to do a first right of refusal, those property owners that we talked to. Anything to save money. I mean, frankly, I work on that every day because I realize I have a precious resource, and that's a limited amount of funds from the city and other entities.
So all of the property owners that we have under contract did not agree to have first refusal rights?
We had those discussions during the process of negotiations on the front end.
So my question is, all the property owners that we put under land options refuse that?
Yes. In fact, I think in most cases, they ask us, what would we be willing to purchase? And only going forward would they consider an option, and that was after protracted negotiation.
Okay.
They didn't want anything under option, frankly, in most cases. They didn't want us to tie up the property. That's what an option does. They wanted certainty of purchase.
Correct. And, okay. My next question is, you know, what I'm reading in the paper and what I'm hearing tonight is that the EDC is going to have a new role, and they're going to be, you know, helping to raise monies for MIP through MU and the MU alumni, and I'm kind of curious how that relationship is going to be worked out. Will the BSGI or the EDC be working on behalf of MU with their alumni? Also, how much time is going to be devoted for you and the EDC to raising money for MU?
That will be something I'll be less involved in day to day, although I'll be a party to certain meetings and conversations. That's yet to be determined. This information has come to us really relatively recently, and our focus has been to assist MU in terms of their leasehold interest in the community, after which I think we're going to look at how do we formalize the capital campaign strategy. Maybe to get to the heart of your question, will I be out raising capital funds directly on a day-to-day basis? The answer is no. Will I be a part of that conversation? Absolutely.
I guess my question is, because is that going to be a split? I mean, if we've hired people to raise funds for MU, whether it's Robin Schuletter or any of the lobbyists that we've hired, is there going to be a split? Do they raise the money for MU, and do we keep half of it for MIP? Is half of it for MU?
As I mentioned, I haven't worked, my partner in this equation is MU, and we've not sat down to determine how we would do that. It's a good question. I just don't have an answer.
And I guess, just because it raises a lot of questions, does MU pay the EDC financial support for raising money for them, because it's going to benefit them too? So it just raises.
Well, I have a lot of questions too, and I usually don't end up with all the answers, but keep asking. I'll do the best I can.
And then the last question, I had a couple of citizens ask me from my district, so I'm asking this just because it's been asked of me and maybe other people sitting up here, and my answer was, I don't know. I assume no. The question is, has the EDC or the BSGI, do they pay their board members, or are they offered any compensation?
I don't think anybody in the audience, I have several board members, would tell you they receive any.
I didn't think so,
pay.
but...
I do want to, and I'm remiss for not recognizing, these board members from both organizations contribute a great deal of time. I spend a lot of time, and I use the word hog as a good description. I take a lot of the mayor's time because this project is so significant. I couldn't do this if it was just a paid staff person. They run committees, they advance discussions, they help to facilitate meetings at the state and at the regional level. So, no, they don't.
Well, thank you for volunteering, and I assume that was the answer, but, you know, I didn't know for certain. And then the last question I had was, has the EDC or BSGI ever paid a city councilman for services rendered?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Not to your knowledge? Okay. Then that was another question that was asked of me, so I can tell them, no, we don't. So the EDC has never paid a city councilman or a sitting city councilman for services?
No. And almost everything that we've done related to this project has flowed through Blue Springs Growth Initiative. During the early days where capital was very limited, the EDC would undertake modest expenses and then turn those in to get reimbursed. We have an accountant that reviews this. We have two boards that review it. We have our legal counsel that help to incorporate both entities that has really written a prescriptive set of instructions of how we balance between both entities, because they're functionally different, but they can support and complement the same goal and outcome, but with different intent and purposes in terms of their corporate nature.
And that's the end of my questions. I want to thank you for being so patient, answering all my questions. I know for many of us sitting up here, the taxpayers of Blue Springs are at this point in time the primary investors in MIP. They have invested $850,000. As you keep stressing, these are hard economic times. That's a lot of money. And I'm happy that we brought some transparency on how that money has been spent tonight, and for you coming before us and answering my questions. Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Any other questions of Mr. Starner? Councilman Fowler.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you, Brian, for everything you talked to us about tonight. Thank you, Councilman Solon, for a lot of good questions. I want to talk about, or have you asked relative to if, life sciences goes from Manhattan to Columbia, or, this big corridor, there's some folks that are kind of concerned that, well, it's very broad with the exception of their parcel of land. How about going north of I-70 and evaluating land on that side? I know that there's some concerns, property owners over there, that maybe they don't think they've been given full opportunity to be competitive in this process. And
I appreciate that question.
They've got a lot of good opportunities, and maybe even some investors that would like to help the project go.
I can share with you that this summer, not at our direction, but at the initiation of Trammell Crow, they engaged in direct conversations, and I don't know if it was with the party or the property owners that are in this room, but certainly with the bank, about acquiring that property. And that was done without direction from anybody that was part of the Missouri Innovation Park process. We said, whatever you do, that's at your own risk and effort. We're not going to pay for that. That wasn't part of the original scoping. That's not what we brought in front of you. That's not what we had been in agreement with as we developed the communications with MU, and they advanced that conversation. And I'm aware of other parties that have been part of conversations, several of which I facilitated directly. And every effort and attempt has been made to direct opportunity. The challenge for you all, for every city in Missouri, because I'm down in the Capitol about 3 days a week, is there is no golden goose laying eggs. There are no numerous jobs looking to be created because of this economy. The challenge is, how do communities position in this economy where the job losses probably aren't going to end for 18, maybe 24 months? The challenge for us is we need to be in the front gate position, so when this economy does come back, and it will, it might come back in a completely different format than we know it today, that it brings prosperity to all of Blue Springs. And I can assure you, having helped to sell, promote, recognize, advance, and market the South Development Area, the EDC doesn't just recognize and advance and promote for its investors. It does it for the entire community because we represent the interests of the city as an investor in the organization. So to answer your question, yes, we'd be happy to help promote and advance recognition of that property, and frankly, any other property that's in the municipal boundaries.
Your Honor, I just had a follow-up question to.
That was your last one a while ago.
Well, I know, but Councilman Fowler brought another one up for me since he brought it up. It was my understanding, I know Councilman Fowler brought up that Trammell Crow felt that the 104 acres around Lake Remembrance, because of its visibility off of the interstate, because of the amenities that it had with the lake, was actually a more advantageous piece of property than the property that was assembled by the EDC. My question is, if Trammell Crow, the master developer we hired, thought that this was property we should be looking at, that it was more advantageous, why didn't we take a look at it?
Well, they did. I'm not saying we did. They did take a look at it. The question here, and if I were to sum it up to one point, is we can all take a look at property. There's no shortage of real estate in Kansas City. There's 6,000 square miles of Kansas City. There's property everywhere. We don't have a lot of it in Blue Springs, and that's certainly a very conspicuous, high-value piece of real estate. The challenge is, after we've already advanced this project, I've been working on it for better part of 3 years, formally for over 2. You get to a point in any project where you could go back to the beginning, but you're going to lose a lot of your sunken costs and investments. Recognizing that we needed to be sensitive to any property that Trammell Crow brought to us, we said, do you have a contract? And their answer was no. And I said, well, then how do you advance a piece of property that you can't get a counter on in a negotiation and you don't have a contract? Because we have contracts. They didn't have an answer for that, and they never did show us a contract. So I was left with, I have a bird in hand, something that the entire group had agreed to. We had presented to the city. All the parties to the Missouri Innovation Park Planning Committee have been participating in the conversation. We deferred consideration by Trammell Crow to take a look at that property. And in fact, they might well come back. The challenge is, if you don't have a contract, you're just talking about real estate and what ifs. And I can't stop your investment in the EDC on a what if.
I guess I would probably challenge a few things you've said. First thing was that we have property all over the city. I would say that this 104 acres is quite unique.
I agree.
Because it's got $1 million lake that the city put in.
I agree.
That is interstate frontage, it's highly desired and developable. I would imagine, I know when Mizzou first was looking at Blue Springs, one of their very important requirements was interstate frontage. This has now moved where it's definitely not off the interstate, and it's basically behind a shopping mall. So it has changed. And I know you also made the statement that you had a bird in the hand. Well, you actually had land options. We didn't actually own any of the property.
There are options with certain contract prices. And although some of those may well have to be renegotiated, we've already begun those conversations. That's completely different than where Trammell Crow failed to get on the north side. And if they would have had a contract, it could have been a different conversation. But we all need to recognize, I'm one person facilitating a multi-organizational, multi-party process, including with the private sector. I don't unilaterally get to dictate any particular outcome. In fact, the art of why we're here tonight is the exact facilitation that I've helped to undertake with all the people that are a party to this, the council, the mayor, University of Missouri, the board members of both organizations, entities like Mid-Continent Public Library. And we'll continue to talk to parties that own property in this community, including on the north side, but I can't immediately promise anything for anybody out there because there's just no deal flow that in most cases you have to have in order to support a loan from a banking institution, and that's typically under fairly stringent requirements today.
And I guess I would just add, I have been a very vocal proponent for the last 2 years, as you know, for this property. I have set up meetings with the mayor and with you to listen to the landowners, and I guess my feeling is that we shouldn't be playing favoritism of certain landowners.
Councilman Sullivan, it's not a matter of that. I think when Trammell Crow came on board, as Mr. Sterner said, there are already options in place. Matter of fact, there was a lot of goodwill to get a lot of those options. Trammell Crow didn't present any contract. And again, this project is about connectivity. It's about a number of things more than just looking at the surface. So I think we've had enough discussion on the 104.
Your Honor, I had a few more comments to
not
make.
on the 104 acres. We're going to stick to the innovation proposal at hand that we're working on.
Well, and I would guess, I would venture to say the next comments that I make really do have to do with the MIP park, because in discussions when I asked the question why we were not considering the 104 acres, I was told because it wasn't big enough. That was the #1 reason, because it wasn't big enough. But now we've gone from 225 acres to 117 acres. So I guess things have changed, because now it actually probably would be big enough for what we're looking for. And what the mayor had said as far as that all the property that you had land options on were contiguous is not really true, because the Barnes property was not attached and not contiguous to all of this. So that actually would be an untrue statement, whereas the property on the other side is contiguous and is all together.
And that is not enough land to be able to have the 200 and some acres. It's only 104. We're talking about 117 in the first phase. There are 2 more phases to go. So anyway, again, we've had enough discussion about that. Thank you, Mr. Sterner.
Your Honor,
Questions?
I don't have a question, I have a comment, if you want to take it.
Yes.
I would like to thank, from my part, all the board people that put in their time on that, and coming from a business standpoint of owning my own business and knowing how valuable that time is. In some aspects, I think you probably lost money in all the time and effort that you all put into this project, and I deeply appreciate that. The other thing I'd like to make a comment about is that when Adams Dairy was first conceived and ground broke way back when, Councilman Fowler, you attested to this, I know, several times in past. One of the visions was that to be a flex-tax office park. And in my experience, and correct me if you will, this is our first real chance since that was broke ground, since dirt was turned, to have kind of along that lines of that dream. And I thank Brian for all the work he's done, and Bill, I know you've spent many hours doing that, and I really do appreciate that, and I really thank MU for coming here, because I think that's one thing I always felt our community lost. When we lost the community college, which was an extended higher education, I thought that really hurt us as a community. Now to see that maybe we're getting an MU presence back here, a higher education presence back here, to me, I think that's a real golden apple there to grab and hang on to, because that'll do more for our community down the road than any of us can imagine. But that's my comments on the issue.
Thank you. Councilman? Okay. That concludes. No, you may not. Next, we go to mayoral announcements. We have three. Number one is we need to be conscious and also be prayerful in our thoughts for the people in Chile that had the earthquake. There are a lot of lives been lost, just as it was in Haiti. It appears that we're having these more frequently than we're used to. But we certainly, our hearts and our prayers and our thoughts goes out to not only Chile, but continued prayers for the people in Haiti, as their lives have been devastated. Number two, before something that I've started to do, and that's thoughts to ponder, is when my phone started ringing in my coat. My great-grandson is en route, and hopefully will be arriving before midnight tonight. So within the next 4 to 5 days, Jaden will be ruling the Ross Nest. He's 1 year old. He turned 1 year old on February 22nd, and we're anxious for him to get here. Well, I'm anxious to see my daughter and granddaughters too, but to have a great-grandson is kind of special. And then last but not least is thoughts to ponder. Tonight it comes from Will Rogers. Even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. That brings us to visitors. I have one visitor's form, and that's from Mr. Jeff Quibell. Would you like to speak, or are you? Okay.
Thank you.
All right, he's chosen not to speak. I don't have any other visitors' forms. Those need to be, Todd, would you get those? No, we have some forms that we didn't get picked up. Would you give that to Todd?
Mayor?
Yes.
Might take a brief step back in regards to the Innovation Park. You know, there's a lot of discussion regarding land and EDC and BSGI and all these things. Let's not forget that MU is the deciding factor here, and their wishes need to be taken into consideration as well. So we can look at all the aspects of it, but MU, we certainly appreciate your voice in this whole thing too.
Certainly, it's a partnership. It's a partnership, a collaboration. Any one party cannot make this happen, especially something to this particular scale and this magnitude. This is big. This is big. We know, we talk about the animal health corridor running from Manhattan to Columbia. MU has more research capacity than KU and MU combined, but they're closer. So by having MU's presence in the Kansas City area, we know most of that commercialization is going to happen in the greater Kansas City area because it's a transportation hub. It's where most of your educational process will be in being able to move product. It's going to be in the Kansas City area. Missouri has been behind the 8 ball in the past because we couldn't compete with Kansas. They've done some legislative things that we're just trying to get done in Missouri right now. Thank God that Governor Nixon brought David Kerr from Kansas to Missouri. he knows how to make things happen. And I witnessed that when I was in Jefferson City to testify, and Brian Starner was there for that, to testify for the Senate bill that contains our language. He understands, and we've had subsequent meetings when the Blue Springs Chamber was in Jefferson City. David Kerr came over and addressed us, and we asked some questions. I put him on the spot to make him understand what Blue Springs, the Jobs of the Future project is all about, and he understands. He understands that. So I think we're going to have a lot of success because of some of the dynamics that's starting to happen right now. Mr. Gilderhouse, you wish to address us, and your subject is the Blue Springs EDC.
Mayor Board, I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. I'm not going to take very long at all here tonight because I think the balance of our concerns, my partners, the owners of that 104 acres we're referring to, we need to take that to the Economic Development Commission. We do intend to do that. We had one meeting scheduled for last Friday and wasn't able to make that meeting. So we will set that up. I do want to say that all of our group supports this project. There's no question. We had some concerns ourselves on the 104 acres. Everyone in this room knows how bad the economy is right now. You know, we just felt we were not being represented. Okay, we had some meetings, but that's for us to take up to the Economic Development Board. And I understand that, Mayor. Talked to that earlier tonight. We do support MU. Actually, MU rents from me right now in my building downtown. Don't necessarily want to lose them in a couple years, but we want a shot at possibly the opportunity of working with the MU on our site. We do have a national developer that we're working with today. Mayor, I think you had quite a conversation with them today. They're ready to go. You know, there's just a lot of things that have happened, and I wanted to make it clear tonight, you know, very clear, because I've heard a lot of things on the street, you know, disgruntled property owners and things. It's not that. We're all fighting for our lives today, okay? We want the same opportunity to develop our property as any other developer in this community. And we don't feel like we've got that. We just don't. Now, that's something we got to take, so we all understand, to that of the board. So I appreciate coming in here tonight. And if there's any questions of me that I could answer tonight, I think the board got, I got a lot of answers tonight. I did, sitting here, okay? Ones that I wanted to hear. Those are things now that I'll take to that Economic Development Board, and hopefully they end there, and I'm not back here in front of you in a couple weeks.
But certainly the decisions that they make are binding with them. And certainly the city is a partner. A number of the members on the board are appointed by me and confirmed by this body. But yeah, those are the decisions that they need to make.
Yes. Your Honor, I would like to say that, you know, on the south side of the highway, we've got a nice amenity, the golf course. On the north side, we've got a nice amenity, the lake. And if it's going to be as big as you talk about, then hopefully it'll expand to both sides of the road.
That's my hope. I hope it does. I hope it expands every available piece of property in Blue Springs, except I need to save some housing. Because these high-paying jobs, I want them to have some nice housing in Blue Springs. So anyway, yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mayor.
Coming.
Thank you, Board.
That's the last form that I have. I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed no. Motion carries. We adjourn.